are going to win the peace that follows.
On the morning of Sunday, December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a devastating attack on the American base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This brutal strike shocked the American people and led to the United States' active entry into World War II. But to understand why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, one must start with a basic and constant reality. Japan was an industrially expanding country, settled on territory with limited strategic resources. That combination alone does not explain a war, but it does explain the way Japanese leadership interpreted national security over decades. In Tokyo, it became common to think that the country's survival, its prestige, and its internal stability depended on securing markets, sea routes, and sources of raw materials outside the archipelago. By the end of the 19th century, Japan was no longer an isolated state. The accelerated modernization of the Meiji period transformed its administration, its economy, and above all, its military capacity. The country adopted Western institutions, technologies, and doctrines with a practical goal: to avoid being subordinated by the great powers and, if possible, to become one of them. This impulse was not merely ideological. Japan observed the map. The world was divided into empires, concessions, protectorates, and spheres of influence. In this context, many Japanese leaders concluded that independence was not guaranteed only by borders, it was guaranteed by power. This logic translated early into regional expansion. The victory over China in the 1894 to 1895 war, and later the victory over Russia in 1904 to 1905, had decisive effects. Japan not only gained territories and strategic positions, it gained international recognition and an internal conviction the country could compete with European powers if it combined industry, social discipline, and military strength. Korea came under Japanese control and was finally annexed in 1910. In Manchuria, Japan obtained railway interests and a military presence through the Kwantung Army, a structure that over time would become more than an instrument. It would become a political actor with its own agenda. World War I also shifted the balance in Asia. With the European powers concentrated in Europe, Japan took advantage of the opportunity to expand its presence in the Pacific and in China, occupying German positions and consolidating advantages. But the outcome of that period was ambiguous. Japan strengthened, yes, but the suspicion of other powers also grew, especially the United States and the British Empire, who viewed the Pacific as vital space for trade, naval routes, and geopolitical balance. In the 1920s, Japan's relationship with the international order was largely defined by naval balance. For an island power, the Navy was not a luxury. It was the circulatory system that connected the country to the outside world. Japan needed to import oil, iron, copper, rubber, and also export manufactured goods and maintain access to markets. All of this depended on secure routes. In this framework, post-war naval agreements attempted to limit the arms race by setting tonnage ratios between the main navies. For Japan, these limitations were experienced in a contradictory way. On one hand, they reduced budgetary pressure and offered some stability. On the other, they fueled a sense of unequal treatment, as if Japan were allowed at the table but in a lower seat. This sense had a symbolic and political component. Many Japanese perceived that, despite their modernization and military victories, the West still treated them as a second-class power. At the same time, Japanese society mixed tendencies: sectors seeking international cooperation and trade, and nationalist sectors demanding a harder policy to secure economic space and imperial prestige. The tension between these lines ran through governments, the press, academia, and the armed forces. The global economy aggravated this conflict. The 1929 crisis and the subsequent depression hit global trade and pushed powers toward protectionist policies. For Japan, this meant more closed markets and internal pressure, falling exports, rural crisis, urban unemployment, and social discontent. In this atmosphere, the militarist argument gained strength. If the world closed in blocks and tariffs, Japan had to secure supply areas and captive markets on its own. The idea of an imperial self-sufficient economic bloc began to sound less like ambition and more like a solution. At the same time, within the Japanese state, a delicate institutional change was occurring. The army and navy were not simply tools subordinate to the civilian government. They had autonomy, political weight, and a strong corporate culture. In practice, they could influence governments and, in moments of crisis, push national decisions in a military direction. In particular, the army on the continent developed the conviction that Japan could not depend on an international system that, in its view, was volatile and controlled by rivals. Manchuria was the point where all variables intersected. It was nearby, extensive, rich in resources, and connected to already established Japanese interests. For those who thought in terms of security and economy, Manchuria was a geographical solution to island vulnerability. Coal, iron, investment space, as well as a buffer zone against continental threats. For those defending international cooperation, expanding by force was dangerous. It could isolate Japan, provoke sanctions, and push it into an escalation impossible to control. That discussion existed, but in a country where the legitimacy of the armed forces was high and the political climate was hardening, the balance began to tilt. The immediate breaking point was a local incident that became a national strategic turning point. On September 18, 1931, the Mukden incident occurred, an explosion on the South Manchurian Railway, which served as a pretext for Japanese forces to advance and take control of the region. Manchuria and the break with the international order. In the fall of 1931, Manchuria became the laboratory for a new form of Japanese expansion. It was not just about occupying a region. It was about turning that occupation into a stable political and economic system, presentable to the world and useful for the strategic objectives of the empire. The idea was twofold. First, to secure a continental base that would reduce the vulnerability of an island country dependent on imports. Second, to demonstrate that Japan could shape Northeast Asia at its convenience without asking permission from the Western powers. The sequence was rapid. After Mukden, Japanese forces consolidated control over cities, railway hubs, and administrative centers. In the short term, this offered clear advantages: protection of investments, control of transportation lines, and a deeper security perimeter against possible pressures from China or the Soviet Union. But the cost was equally evident. Japan was violating the principles of the post-war international order, particularly the idea of territorial integrity and the diplomatic resolution of disputes at a time when multilateral mechanisms existed to manage conflicts. The problem for Tokyo was that Manchuria could not be sustained by garrisons alone. A political entity had to be created to normalize the occupation. That step materialized in 1932 with the proclamation of Manchukuo, a state that Japan presented as independent, but that in practice functioned under Japanese tutelage. The installation of Puyi, the last Qing emperor, as a central figure was a carefully calculated move. It sought to give historical legitimacy to a political construction born of force. The message outward was that Japan was not conquering, it was ordering and stabilizing a supposedly chaotic region. That narrative aligned with a recurring justification in official and military speeches. Japan presented itself as a modernizing power and a guarantor of stability in the face of what it described as internal Chinese corruption, banditry, regional fragmentation, and the communist threat. Manchuria was portrayed as a space where the central Chinese authority was weak and where, therefore, Japanese intervention could be sold as defensive and civilizing. In practical terms, this narrative sought to disguise a fact. Japan was creating a satellite designed to serve its security and economy. The internal effect of Manchukuo was enormous. The operation in Manchuria became proof that the military could act, achieve results, and then force politics to align. The initial success strengthened the culture of the fait accompli. If a military action achieved objectives and generated popular support, the political system tended to absorb it as a new starting point, not as a deviation to correct. In a society struck by economic crisis, expansion also offered a story of national pride and an exit toward the continent, which was attractive to urban sectors and, above all, to propaganda. Meanwhile, the international reaction was a preview of what would happen a decade later. The post-war order had created institutions to respond to crises of this kind, the main one being the League of Nations. China appealed to that body. Japan, for its part, argued that its action was legitimate for security reasons and that Manchukuo represented regional self-determination. But the dispute was not only legal, it was strategic. The question was whether the League of Nations could stop a power determined to change the map in Asia. The international investigation ultimately crystallized in a report that rejected the legitimacy of the new state and questioned the Japanese narrative of self-determination. For Tokyo, this was interpreted as a humiliation, and worse, as an indication that the world was structured to block its aspirations. The Japanese response was not to retreat, it was to break. In 1933, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations. That gesture had political significance beyond diplomacy. Japan was signaling that it would not accept an international order that, in its view, protected Western interests and restricted Japan's margin of action in its own region. That break had cumulative consequences. First, it deepened Japan's isolation within the multilateral system. Second, it reinforced the idea that moral or diplomatic sanctions would have no real effect if Japan acted quickly and decisively. Third, it fueled a sense of encirclement. If the West condemned expansion while controlling markets and sea routes, then Japan had to prepare for a future in which access to resources could be cut off by external pressure. Manchuria also consolidated a concrete economic logic. The region offered raw materials and industrial possibilities that Japan needed. In Japanese plans, Manchuria was to become a cog, providing resources, absorbing investment, hosting infrastructure, and serving as a base for heavy development that would complement metropolitan industry. That vision was especially attractive to those who thought of modern war in industrial terms. The experience of World War I and subsequent wars had shown that conflicts were no longer won just with discipline or tactics. They were won with steel, fuel, mass production, and transport. Manchuria, in that framework, was a strategic reserve, but there was a central contradiction. The construction of Manchukuo did not solve the Chinese problem, it opened it. China did not accept the loss of Manchuria as an irreversible fact. Nationalist pressure grew. The legitimacy of resistance increased, and Japan was trapped in a dynamic in which each step to consolidate its new position provoked political and military reactions from the other side. Instead of stabilizing the region, the occupation introduced a long-term conflict with constant friction, sabotage, border tensions, and an escalation that became difficult to stop without admitting defeat. In Tokyo, some sectors understood the risk. Manchuria could become a trap requiring increasingly more resources, troops, and commitments without guaranteeing security. However, the institutional weight of the army, the prestige gained from the operation, and the political climate of the time pushed in the opposite direction. Yielding was politically costly. Insisting seemed, at least for a time, the only way for the expansion to make sense. China as a long war, attrition, costs, and a dead end. Between 1933 and 1937, Japan consolidated positions in northern China and around Manchuria through coercive agreements, military pressure, and the creation of zones of influence. The strategy was not yet to conquer all of China. It was to secure a continental belt that would protect Manchukuo, expand economic control, and weaken the Chinese government's ability to resist. But the internal logic of this strategy led to a problem. Each secured zone required a military presence, and that presence in turn generated local resistance, which justified further deployment. It was a circle. The breaking point occurred in July 1937 with the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing. The episode began as a tactical clash, maneuvers, a missing soldier, access demands, exchange of fire. However, the historical significance does not lie in the exact origin of the incident, but in what happened afterward. Instead of being contained, it escalated openly. Within a few weeks, the conflict ceased to be a localized dispute and became the Second Sino-Japanese War, a war on a large scale. Japan began operations with military superiority and confidence in a quick victory. That confidence was based on several premises: that China was politically fragmented, that its army was poorly equipped, that its logistics were weak, and that Japanese military pressure would force negotiations. The expectation was that a decisive blow would be enough to break the will of the Chinese government and obtain permanent concessions. But that expectation proved wrong. China, under the leadership of the nationalist government, interpreted the war as an existential matter and, instead of collapsing, reorganized its resistance. At the same time, Chinese geography and territorial depth worked in favor of the defender. Even losing cities, China could retreat, relocate administrative centers, and maintain state continuity. Japan could capture ports and regional capitals, but that did not mean controlling a vast country or its interior. In 1937, Japan captured Beijing and Tianjin, then advanced toward Shanghai, one of the most important economic and symbolic centers. The Battle of Shanghai was an enormous, prolonged, and costly clash that disproved the idea of a victory without attrition. For Japan, it was a signal that China was willing to pay an extremely high price. For Japanese leadership, it also had a psychological effect. If China resisted even in a key urban center, the war would not be short. The advance toward Nanjing and its capture at the end of 1937 consolidated Japanese control over strategic areas but did not resolve the conflict. On the contrary, the war hardened, and Japanese control became more about corridors, cities, and rail lines than about the territory as a whole. Inland supply lines were stretched. Politically, the occupation did not produce a Chinese collaborationist government capable of pacifying the country with sufficient legitimacy. Japan tried to create aligned administrations, but these structures depended on Japanese military presence and did not replace the Chinese state as the focus of loyalty. As 1938 progressed, Japan gained more space, capturing Wuhan after a long campaign and consolidating a key coastal and river corridor. But each victory expanded a problem. More occupied territory meant more troops needed to hold it, which tied forces to garrison duties. At the same time, the type of war began to change. Guerrilla warfare, sabotage, attacks on supply lines, constant harassment. It was a conflict that drained resources and offered no clear end point. This attrition carried increasing economic costs. Japan was sustaining a prolonged war with enormous consumption of material, ammunition, fuel, merchant ships, spare parts, steel. For a country dependent on foreign trade, the war in China was from the start a dangerous gamble. The war effort strained the balance of payments, increased state spending, and forced management of scarce resources. Japan could produce a lot, but it needed to import vital inputs for that production. The fuel problem was central. Modern war, especially for a power intending to operate with a navy and air force, depended on oil. Japan did not have petroleum self-sufficiency in its territory. Its industry, navy, and air force were supplied by imports. While Japan was fighting in China, its dependence on an external supply grew, which ultimately could be cut off by political decisions of maritime powers, especially the United States and the British Empire. At this point, the direct link to Pearl Harbor appears. The war in China created a strategic dilemma. Japan did not want to abandon China because that would mean recognizing limits and losing imperial prestige, but continuing meant consuming resources Japan did not control and therefore depended on the tolerance of powers that were beginning to view Japan as a threat. The longer the war dragged on, the more fragile Japan's position became in the face of sanctions and external pressure. On the diplomatic front, Japan began to clash with Western opinion and interests. The United States, not yet at war, watched Japanese expansion with growing concern. The US administration did not view the conflict as a simple regional war. It interpreted it as an attack on the open door principle in China and as a threat to stability in East Asia. Moreover, the brutality of the occupation and the reports circulating in the international press strengthened public perception in the West and increased political willingness to exert economic pressure on Japan. The US response at this stage was not war, but a gradual policy of restrictions, limited aid to China, and signals of disapproval. For Japan, these signals could be read in two ways: as a warning that its expansion had externally imposed limits, or as proof that the West sought to block its imperial consolidation. In either case, the result was the same. A structurally conflictual relationship was forming between Japan and the United States. Europe at war and the strategic opportunity, Indochina and the turn south. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and war began in Europe, the impact on Asia was not immediate in military terms, but it was immediate in strategic terms. The European colonial powers that controlled large parts of Southeast Asia were suddenly absorbed by an existential conflict on their own continent. France, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands, which maintained their empires in Asia through garrisons, trade, and prestige, began to show cracks. For Japan, this scenario raised a question that would define its foreign policy. If the European powers were weakened, was this the moment to forcibly secure the regions containing oil, rubber, tin, and other raw materials Japan needed to sustain the war in China and its own industrial development? Up to that point, Japanese expansion had been primarily focused on the Asian continent along the axis Manchuria, northern China, the Chinese coast. But the problem of fuel and imperial self-sufficiency was not solved by Manchuria or occupied China. Even controlling important areas, Japan still depended on external sources for critical resources, especially oil. The war in China consumed enormous amounts of fuel and material, and the ocean with its trade routes was a constant reminder of vulnerability. If access to imports were cut off, the Japanese war machine could not sustain high-tempo operations for long. In this context, the so-called Turn South gained strength, a strategic line that considered Southeast Asia and the European colonies as the natural space to build a self-sufficient economic bloc under Japanese control. The logic was cold and operational. Southeast Asia offered oil in the Dutch East Indies, rubber in Malaysia, tin and other resources. Controlling this arc meant reducing dependence on imports from the United States and other suppliers who could impose political conditions. For decision-makers in Tokyo, the argument was that Japan was not seeking expansion for empty prestige, but out of material necessity. But that necessity would quickly become a justification for further escalation. The year 1940 was decisive because the war in Europe abruptly changed the equation. The fall of France to Germany in June left the French government in a weakened position and with limited capacity to defend its colonial empire. French Indochina, which included strategic territories due to its location and infrastructure, became vulnerable to pressure. For Japan, Indochina was valuable for several reasons. It was close to southern China, served as a platform to cut supply routes to the Chinese nationalists, and at the same time was a gateway to Southeast Asia. It was not yet the main oil prize, but it was a key step on the way. Japan pressured for military and logistical concessions in Indochina. The immediate goal was to disrupt the flow of supplies to China and strengthen the continental strategy. However, the actual result was broader. Japan was expanding its presence into an area the Western powers considered part of the colonial balance in the Pacific. Every Japanese move southward was read in Washington, London, and other capitals as another step toward regional domination. The difference in interpretation was profound. Tokyo could describe it as a necessary measure to close the Chinese front. The West saw it as a direct threat to trade routes, colonies, and commercial principles. At the same time, the link between Japan and Germany strengthened. Cooperation did not mean Japanese subordination to Berlin nor automatic adoption of European objectives, but it did imply political alignment that increased Western distrust. In 1940, a formal alliance with Germany and Italy was established, projecting the image of a global revisionist bloc. For Japan, this alliance offered advantages: psychological deterrence, diplomatic coordination, and a way to present itself as a power capable of challenging the established order. But it also had a cost. It brought Japan closer to the category of a potential enemy of the United States, even if Tokyo tried to avoid a direct clash. This turn south and political alignment developed in a scenario where Japan was already engaged in China. It is important to understand that Japan did not make a clean decision between China and the Pacific. It attempted to maintain both directions, and this simultaneity multiplied the risks. The war in China remained unresolved, absorbing troops and resources. At the same time, expanding southward implied new military obligations, new supply lines, and the danger of triggering an economic and naval response from the United States. US policy at this stage began to harden. Washington observed three connected facts. Japan was waging an occupation war in China, Japan was advancing into weakened European colonial areas, and Japan was aligning with powers at war with the Allies in Europe. In this context, the United States began to consider economic pressure tools as a means to stop Japanese expansion without yet entering the war. The US power in this area was particularly strong because Japan was heavily dependent on imports, and the United States was a main source of strategic inputs, including oil and scrap metal. For Tokyo, the effect of this pressure was not only economic, it was psychological and doctrinal. Every US restriction reinforced the idea that Japan was being encircled. This perception of encirclement did not arise solely from propaganda. It was fed by material reality. Japan was expanding its empire, and the more it expanded, the more it depended on sea routes and supplies that could be interrupted. Japanese planners looked at the map and reached a disturbing conclusion. If Japan advanced south, sooner or later it would collide with US interests. And if the United States decided to cut off the oil flow, Japan would have a limited time to maintain operations. In 1940, diplomatic alternatives and negotiation margins still existed. Japan could theoretically reduce the intensity of the war in China, moderate its expansion southward, and maintain sufficient trade relations to avoid a total cut-off of resources. But these options clashed with domestic politics and the logic of imperial prestige. Abandoning objectives in China could be interpreted as defeat. Halting the advance south could be seen as giving up self-sufficiency. Moreover, the military apparatus had enormous influence over decision-making and viewed any sign of retreat with suspicion. Sanctions, embargo, and oil, the economic military clock begins to tick. At the beginning of the 1940s, Japan's military capability no longer depended solely on its shipyards, arsenals, or the discipline of its forces. It depended on a quieter and more decisive variable: stable access to imported raw materials, especially oil. In practice, this meant that Japanese strategy was tied to the will of powers controlling global trade and supplies. And among these powers, none was as important as the United States. The tightening of American pressure did not happen overnight. It was gradual, calculated, and at first still reversible. Washington sought to pressure Japan to slow expansion without going to war, but the tool of economic pressure had an inherent problem. The more effective it was, the more it pushed Japan toward an extreme decision. The logic was simple. If Japan accepted the pressure and retreated, it avoided war but paid a huge political cost in imperial prestige and internal stability. If it rejected the pressure, it needed to forcibly secure the resources it could no longer obtain through trade. The turning point was oil. During 1940, the United States began restricting exports of strategic materials to Japan. Among them were scrap metal and certain key industrial inputs. These measures had a dual objective: to weaken Japan's capacity to sustain its war and to send a political signal that expansion would not be tolerated indefinitely. From Tokyo's perspective, however, the restrictions were interpreted as an indirect attack on Japanese sovereignty. It was not seen as a commercial dispute, but as an attempt to force a decision: abandon China and give up the imperial project, or face increasing consequences. The problem for Japan was that the war in China, far from stabilizing, required a constant flow of resources. Militarily, Japan could dominate urban areas, rail lines, and coastal zones, but sustaining that occupation required fuel, transport, spare parts, and continuous logistics. Moreover, air and naval warfare was by definition petroleum-intensive, and the Japanese Navy, the country's strategic pride, was a sophisticated machine whose real autonomy depended on full fuel tanks. As restrictions multiplied, Japan accelerated stockpiling plans. Storing oil and materials was a rational measure, but it was also a confession. Japan assumed that supplies could be interrupted, and if that assumption was true, strategic planning changed. It was no longer just about how to win in China or how to expand south, but about how long can the empire survive if the tap is turned off. Once this question reached the political and military leadership, priorities were reordered. The debate ceased to be ideological and became arithmetic. In 1941, the situation worsened due to Indochina. Japan had already pressured and gained access to northern Indochina in 1940. But the crucial move was the expansion of presence into southern Indochina in 1941. This expansion made sense for Japan for operational reasons, positioning closer to Southeast Asian routes and targets, improving its blocking capacity against China and preparing military options. From the US perspective, however, it was a qualitative leap. It was not just about continuing the war in China. It was about positioning itself at the doorstep of the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia. At this point, the conflict entered a critical phase. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands responded by freezing Japanese assets and tightening trade restrictions. This was not yet combat, but a form of economic warfare. For Japan, freezing assets and limiting trade meant directly constraining its ability to finance imports and maintain the normal functioning of its economy and military machine. The most decisive component was oil. Japan imported most of its fuel, and a significant portion came from suppliers directly or indirectly tied to US export capacity and maritime control. When oil exports became uncertain or were effectively restricted, the situation became a countdown. This was not a matter of weeks on the Chinese front, it was a matter of months for the Navy, Air Force, and industrial economy. At this point, Japan's leadership faced a contradiction that could not be resolved through classical diplomacy. For the United States to relax pressure, Japan would have had to make substantial concessions: halt expansion, withdraw from certain positions, and above all, change course in China. But for Japan, abandoning or visibly reducing its commitment in China meant admitting that years of war, lives, and resources had not achieved the objective. It also involved an internal risk. The army's prestige and the state's credibility could be damaged, fueling political crises and even internal violence. In a system where military influence was strong and the political climate hardened, retreating was not a technical option, it was a threat to internal balance. Thus, the embargo and sanctions did not just reduce resources, they enclosed decision-making. Japan generally had two paths, both costly. One was to accept US conditions, reduce or end expansion, and thereby regain access to trade and oil. The other was to forcibly secure a self-sufficient space in Southeast Asia, capturing the resource-rich regions, especially oil, and then sustaining this new order through naval and military power. The second path necessarily involved a greater problem. To conquer and maintain Southeast Asia, Japan had to assume that the United States would react. And if the United States reacted, the main threat was not a land battle in China, but the US Pacific Fleet. Even if Japan managed to capture resources in Southeast Asia, it still had to transport them to the Japanese islands via long and vulnerable sea routes. This required naval superiority or, at minimum, the ability to deny the sea to the adversary. In other words, capturing oil in the south only solved the problem if Japan could prevent the US from blocking it at sea. By 1941, oil became the most persuasive argument within the Japanese leadership. Not because everyone wanted war, but because decision time was shrinking. Each month without an agreement meant less fuel available for training, deployments, and operations, and an army or navy that stops training and operating normally degrades. In military thinking, allowing forces to degrade due to lack of fuel while negotiating is equivalent to accepting a future defeat. For this reason, the Japanese debate began to reorganize around a concrete question. If there is no agreement, when is it best to act? From a military logic perspective, the answer was unsettling. The sooner, the better, before reserves run out, before the adversary is fully prepared, before economic pressure turns time into an enemy. This logic did not guarantee victory, but it offered a sense of control, to choose the moment of conflict, not to wait for the conflict to arrive when Japan was weaker. The United States, for its part, interpreted its own pressure as a form of deterrence. The expectation was that Japan, faced with economic costs, would reconsider its expansion, but the pressure could also produce the opposite effect, convincing Japan that negotiation would only lead to more demands and that Washington's real objective was to permanently restrain Japan as a power. In that case, if war was inevitable, then the rational course seemed to be to strike first. The political-military decision, why war became acceptable for Tokyo. In the spring of 1941, Japan was already trapped in a three-variable equation that pushed against each other, continuing the war in China, securing resources to the south, and avoiding a war with the United States. The structure of the problem was that in practice, all three goals could not be achieved at the same time. Continuing in China demanded resources and hardened the Western perception of Japan as an aggressive power. Advancing south to obtain resources increased the risk of clashes with American and British interests. Avoiding a war with the United States almost inevitably required moderating or reversing at least one of the first two goals. In this framework, Japanese decision-making became a process of selecting losses. It was not a matter of choosing between victory and defeat, but between risks. Economic risk from the embargo, internal political risk from withdrawal, and military risk from a war against a superior industrial power. Crucially, for a significant part of the leadership, military risk began to appear preferable to internal political risk and the risk of economic strangulation. The reason was not irrationality, but the logic of national security, though based on debatable assumptions. From Tokyo's perspective, the de facto embargo and freezing of assets could be interpreted as an attempt by the United States to paralyze Japan without firing a shot. If Japan accepted that pressure, it could maintain peace, yes, but under conditions. abandoning continental objectives, giving up strategic positions, and accepting that its regional projection would be limited by external decisions. For a state that had built itself for decades on the idea of being a great power, this was perceived as strategic degradation. Internal debate in Japan was not uniform. There were sectors seeking a diplomatic way out, aware that a war with the United States, in industrial terms, was an extremely risky bet. The American economy had massive production capacity, access to raw materials, and strategic depth. Japan, even with its navy and training, could not match that potential in a prolonged conflict. But the question that dominated was different. Would the conflict be long, or could Japan force a quick settlement through a decisive initial strike? Here appears the type of reasoning that made war acceptable. The idea was that the United States, despite its industrial power, might lack the political will for a prolonged war if it suffered a strong initial blow. If Japan managed to neutralize the US Pacific Fleet at the outset, quickly capture Southeast Asia, and fortify a huge defensive perimeter, then the United States would face a costly choice: wage a long war across the ocean to retake positions, or negotiate an agreement recognizing the fate's accomplice. This was the central gamble. Not necessarily a bet on total victory, but a bet on coercion, obtaining a favorable peace through an initial shock and subsequent defense. That logic, however, depended on very specific premises: that the initial strike would truly paralyze US operational capability, that the United States would be demoralized or politically divided, that Japan could consolidate and maintain its perimeter, and that the flow of resources captured in the South would reach Japan despite naval warfare. Each of these premises was uncertain, but at the Japanese table they had appeal. They offered a path that did not involve withdrawing troops from China or accepting conditions perceived as humiliating. In parallel, Japanese politics were shaped by the relationship between the civilian government and military command. The legitimacy of the armed forces was high, and their influence on the structure of the state was decisive. This does not mean that civilians were irrelevant, but any policy involving withdrawal required military backing, and that backing was difficult to obtain in a climate where expansion had become a marker of national prestige. The war in China was presented as a historical mission. Leaving it unfinished meant admitting failure. In the summer of 1941, with access to resources becoming more uncertain, the timing calculation became decisive. Japanese planners evaluated how much fuel remained, how long training could be sustained, how long the fleets could operate, and how much margin existed for a rapid campaign in the South. In that calculus, waiting was not neutral. Waiting meant consuming reserves without resolving the embargo, and therefore weakening. From that logic, if fighting was necessary, it was better to do it before strength deteriorated. At the same time, Japan continued advancing in its strategic positioning. The presence in southern Indochina was not only a measure against China, it was also a step in military preparation. It brought Japan closer to routes, air bases, and deployment points toward Southeast Asia. That preparation, in turn, made the military option more credible. When a state mobilizes logistics, adapts operational plans, and positions forces, the military option ceases to be abstract. It becomes a plan with deadlines, resources, and responsibilities. The more that investment in preparation grows, the harder it becomes to retreat without it appearing as a defeat. The acceptability of war was also constructed by comparison with the scenario imagined in Tokyo. That scenario was strangulation. Japan, isolated without sufficient oil, forced to reduce its fleet with weakened industry, and pressured to negotiate from an increasingly fragile position. In that view, peace was not peace. It was gradual subordination. If that was the future, then a risky strike in the present could seem like the only way to preserve strategic autonomy. But there was a second element. The South was not just a goal, it was a necessity. Japan did not think of Southeast Asia as optional expansion, but as the region where the resources for long-term survival were located. The war in China had shown that Japan could occupy territory, but it could not turn it into energy self-sufficiency. If Japan wanted a stable wartime economy, it needed oil, and the oil was in the South. This meant that even if Japan preferred to avoid war with the United States, the dynamics pushed it toward actions that made that war more likely. At that point, internal politics began to converge with military planning. Japanese leadership had to decide whether it would prioritize an agreement with the United States even at the cost of concessions in China, or prioritize expansion to the south even at the cost of war. Convergence occurred when leadership adopted the idea: negotiate while preparing for war, but accept that negotiation was only feasible if it produced rapid results. In other words, diplomacy had an expiration date. That framework led to a concrete process. Negotiations with the United States continued, but with an internal clock advancing toward the military option. If an agreement did not materialize, the war plan would be activated, not because Japan wanted war as the first option, but because leadership began to consider war inevitable if the United States maintained pressure and Japan did not withdraw from China. Final diplomacy with the United States: proposals, limits, and breakdown. In the summer of 1941, Japan and the United States were holding diplomatic talks while, in parallel, both governments were taking measures that reduced the real space for an agreement. In Washington, the dominant reading was that Japan was not in China by mistake or accident, but by strategic decision, and that any useful agreement had to stop expansion and preserve the regional balance in the Pacific. In Tokyo, the dominant reading was that the United States was using its economic power to impose a political limit on the Japanese imperial project, and that accepting that limit meant withdrawing from China and giving up strategic autonomy. The talks, therefore, were not a simple exchange of proposals and counter-proposals. They were negotiations with a deeper conflict: the incompatibility between the US goal of maintaining an open regional order and the Japanese goal of consolidating a self-sufficient imperial bloc. That incompatibility became sharper after Japan's decision to expand its presence in Indochina. The deployment south in 1941 reinforced the American conviction that Japan was in a preparatory phase to occupy resource-rich areas of Southeast Asia. That conviction was key to the economic response: the freezing of assets and strict trade restrictions, especially on fuel. For Japan, the combination of asset freezes and reduced access to oil turned the negotiation into a race against time. If the Navy and Air Force depended on finite reserves, the Japanese state had to resolve two questions simultaneously: what concessions it could tolerate to restore the flow of resources, and if no acceptable concessions existed, when to begin operations to forcibly secure the southern oil areas before logistical attrition weakened its combat capacity. In that framework, Japanese diplomacy tried to open a path that would allow sanctions to be alleviated without sacrificing the essence of its position in China. Japanese proposals tended to revolve around stabilization or compromise formulas: general promises of no further expansion beyond a certain point, offers to withdraw some troops in phases, guarantees to respect certain territorial integrities, and a willingness to dialogue about China without abandoning the goal of maintaining political and military influence there. But the problem was that the United States was not seeking a partial compromise. It sought a verifiable change in direction. From Washington, any agreement had to include conditions touching the core of the war in Asia: a reduction or significant withdrawal of Japanese forces from China, respect for Chinese sovereignty, and renunciation of military pressures threatening colonies and trade routes in Southeast Asia. Additionally, the United States had to consider the message to other actors. If it yielded to Japan, it would weaken the credibility of its position in the Pacific, especially at a moment when World War was underway and the stability of the colonial and commercial order could collapse. Tension increased because both sides were negotiating not only with the adversary, but also with their own internal limits. In the United States, yielding too much could be interpreted as accepting Japanese expansion and abandoning China, politically problematic and strategically risky. In Japan, yielding too much could provoke a government crisis and a fracture with the military establishment, which saw withdrawal as an unacceptable defeat after years of sacrifice. That symmetry of rigidity meant that even if there was a willingness to avoid war, the space for compatible concessions was narrow. As the months progressed, Tokyo operated with a logic of deadline diplomacy. Negotiations had to produce concrete results within a time horizon that still allowed military plans to be executed under favorable conditions. This was not a technical detail. It meant that diplomacy was subordinated to operational planning. If the agreement did not arrive before a certain point, the war plan would advance by institutional inertia. Mobilization, training, unit assignments, calculation of sea routes, and coordination among Navy, Army, and Air Force cannot be improvised in days. Once this machinery was set in motion, stopping it implied political and strategic costs. In practice, each week without an agreement increased the probability of war because the war preparation machinery became the dominant plan. In Washington, there was also a temporal reading, albeit different. Economic pressure was thought of as a tool to force a change in Japanese behavior. Strategically, the idea was that Japan, faced with resource strangulation, would eventually accept some form of rollback. But that logic had a potential flaw. If Japan interpreted the strangulation as an existential threat, it could decide that fighting was preferable to yielding, even if the chances of winning a long war were low. In that scenario, economic pressure did not deter. It accelerated the decision to attack. The period between September and November 1941 concentrated the final clash of these logics. In Tokyo, the internal consensus moved toward a position. Continue negotiating, yes, but only if the result allowed Japan to maintain its basic position in China and restore the flow of resources. Otherwise, Japan had to secure Southeast Asia by force. That consensus did not eliminate doubts about confronting the United States, but relocated them. The question ceased to be if there would be conflict and became how to maximize Japanese chances in the first months of the clash. This transition was decisive for Pearl Harbor because if Japan was going to occupy Southeast Asia, it needed to neutralize the United States' immediate ability to prevent it. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, concentrated in Hawaii, was the most direct element of that capability. As long as it remained intact and operational, any Japanese operation south ran the risk of being interrupted by U.S. naval and air actions. Therefore, Japanese planning began to treat the attack on that fleet not as an act of prestige, but as an operational condition to buy time. The goal was to open a window in which Japan could capture positions, secure initial routes, and fortify a perimeter broad enough to make a U.S. counteroffensive slow, costly, and politically debatable. Meanwhile, negotiations continued with increasingly tense exchanges. Japan requested the lifting of restrictions and guarantees that trade, especially oil, would resume, in exchange for commitments that did not imply abandoning the essence of its control in China and its regional freedom of action. The United States insisted that there would be no full relief without substantial changes: withdrawal from China, respect for sovereignties, and renunciation of expansion by coercion. At this stage, the distance was not a misunderstanding. It was a clash of objectives. The breakdown did not occur because one side stopped talking, but because the conditions each side considered fundamental became mutually exclusive. In practice, Japan did not agree to withdraw from China as Washington demanded, and Washington did not agree to restore the full flow of resources without that withdrawal. At the same time, Japan continued moving forces and preparing operations south. Each movement confirmed U.S. fears and at the same time increased Japanese investment in the military option. In November 1941, the process reached its irreversible point. Japan ultimately decided that if it did not obtain an agreement that lifted the economic strangulation without dismantling its imperial position, it would begin military operations to secure resources and strategic positions. In parallel, Japanese naval units began to concentrate and move under strict secrecy measures, while diplomacy formally remained active to preserve surprise and keep the possibility of a negotiated solution open until the last moment. On November 26, 1941, the Japanese strike force set sail for the North Pacific. The Pearl Harbor Plan, operational logic and strategic objectives. The deployment of the strike force was not a theatrical gesture or an impulsive act. It was the culmination of a specific operational idea. If Japan was going to initiate a rapid expansion into Southeast Asia to seize resources, it had to prevent the United States from stopping it at the outset. The plan relied on a concrete notion of time. Japan did not intend to destroy the United States as a global power. It intended to gain a strategic window of several months during which it could take key positions, secure sources of oil, establish a broad defensive perimeter, and from there force Washington to choose between a long and costly war or a negotiated agreement recognizing the facts on the ground. The problem Pearl Harbor sought to solve was, therefore, operational. The presence of the U.S. Pacific Fleet as an immediate threat to Japanese maritime communication lines. Hawaii was not important merely as an island on the map. It was a node from which the United States could project power westward, interfere with routes to the Philippines, Guam, and crucially, Southeast Asia. If Japan attacked south without neutralizing that fleet, it risked that an American naval strike would interrupt landings, destroy troop transport, or block supply lines in the first moments when Japan had yet to consolidate anything. For this reason, the plan was conceived as a preventive and concentrated strike whose primary objective was to destroy or incapacitate the operational capacity of the Pacific Fleet in a single blow. The idea was not to occupy Hawaii, but to strike the main base where U.S. naval power in the Central Pacific Theater was concentrated. The choice of Pearl Harbor as the target followed this logic. It was the point where the fleet could be surprised and where a massive airstrike could produce disproportionate effects. This approach represented a significant doctrinal shift. For decades, classical naval thinking had emphasized the Great Fleet Battle with battleships and artillery as the main protagonists. Pearl Harbor, in contrast, relied on the power of carrier-based aviation to produce the effect of a decisive battle without exposing the attacking fleet to direct naval combat. In terms of planning, this was a technological and tactical gamble. It depended on aircraft carriers, precise air coordination, intelligence, secrecy, and training. Japan was not improvising. It was applying a doctrine of initial shock based on capabilities its navy had developed and tested in exercises. The operation also corresponded to a broader strategic calculation. Japan needed to act simultaneously at multiple points. Pearl Harbor could not be an isolated attack. It had to be integrated with offensives in Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Otherwise, the strike would be a destructive act without operational benefit. Therefore, the overall plan included a series of coordinated movements to neutralize or weaken the United States in the Central Pacific while simultaneously attacking and occupying strategic territories that secured resources and defensive positions. In this architecture, Pearl Harbor was the strike meant to prevent immediate American interference while Japan executed its southward expansion. Secrecy was essential. An attack of this kind depended on surprising an opponent who, if fully alert, could have dispersed its units or prepared defenses that would mitigate the damage. For this reason, the strike force sailed through the northern Pacific along a less traveled route and applied strict measures of radio silence and concealment. The logic was to minimize any possibility of early detection. Japan needed the first strike to be massive and surprising to maximize psychological and material impact. The attack was designed with clear priority objectives. On the naval level, the focus was on large warships, especially battleships, because in contemporary naval thinking, these ships represented the core of the force. The intention was, ideally, to sink or incapacitate as many as possible, reducing the United States' capacity to mount an immediate and aggressive response. In addition, the Japanese sought to destroy aircraft on the ground to prevent a short-term aerial reaction. Hitting hangars, runways, and concentrations of aircraft was part of the same calculation. If the opponent had no operational aircraft, its capacity for reconnaissance and immediate counterattack was reduced. But the plan also had practical limitations. An airstrike, even if successful, does not guarantee the total destruction of enemy power. It could sink ships, but not necessarily destroy the entire logistical infrastructure. It could destroy aircraft on the ground, but the United States could quickly replace them if it mobilized its industry. And above all, it might not find the most valuable targets in the harbor. Nevertheless, Japan bet that the immediate damage would be enough to delay the American response, which was the main objective. Japanese planning also incorporated the psychological factor. An unexpected strike on an important base could produce shock, disorganization, and a crisis of confidence in the United States' ability to defend the Pacific. From Tokyo, it was believed that a devastating blow could strengthen political forces in the US favorable to negotiating or at least focusing on Europe before the Pacific. That belief was integrated into the overall calculation. If the United States had to prioritize globally, perhaps the Pacific would remain secondary long enough for Japan to consolidate its perimeter. However, even within this logic, Pearl Harbor was an enormous risk, not only because of the operation itself, but because it involved attacking a power with which Japan was not yet formally at war. This had diplomatic and political implications. The plan required Japan to issue some form of communication indicating the break before the attack. at least to maintain the appearance of international formality. But the operational essence was surprise, and surprise by definition conflicts with any real warning. In this tension, the character of the plan is evident. It was designed to gain an immediate military advantage, even if it resulted in total escalation. Moreover, the operation was linked to the need to protect future supply lines. Capturing oil in Southeast Asia was one thing. Transporting it to Japan, maintaining convoys and protecting routes was another. Japan knew that naval warfare would be decisive. By weakening the US fleet at the outset, it hoped to reduce pressure on its routes for at least a period. This period, in the Japanese view, was the golden opportunity to fortify islands, build airfields, deploy garrisons, and turn the ocean into a defensive field where the United States would have to fight island by island. The Japanese strike force, therefore, was not just a group of ships. It was a condensed strategic bet. Strike first, buy time, seize resources, fortify a perimeter, and then negotiate from a strengthened position. Everything depended on the United States reacting in a specific way. Carefully, prudently, with political costs, and with limited willingness to pay the price of a long war. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japan executed the attack. Why it was still attacked: calculations, errors, and immediate consequences. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, it did so because its leadership concluded that time was working against it. Economic strangulation, particularly regarding oil, meant that Japan could not sustain a long-term waiting strategy. If trade was not restored under acceptable conditions, military capacity would gradually deteriorate. And if Japan retreated in China or gave up its expansion southward to restore trade, the domestic, political, and strategic cost was perceived as unacceptable. In this equation, war became the instrument to break the blockade and secure resources by force. The attack was therefore carried out as a decision intended to solve three problems simultaneously. First, to temporarily neutralize the US Pacific Fleet to allow expansion into Southeast Asia without immediate interference. Second, to produce a psychological shock which, according to Japanese calculations, could weaken American willingness to wage a prolonged war in the Pacific. Third, to gain maneuvering space that would turn the conquest of resource-rich areas and the construction of a defensive perimeter into accomplished facts. The crucial point is that Japan did not attack Pearl Harbor because it believed it could defeat the United States in a long-term industrial war. It attacked because it believed it could avoid such a war, forcing a shorter outcome or favorable negotiation. At the core of this belief was a political assumption that the United States, a democratic society with multiple global interests, would have limits in sustaining a long war if the initial cost was high and if the Pacific theater seemed too distant or too costly compared to Europe. This assumption was the first fundamental strategic mistake. Pearl Harbor did not weaken American resolve, it unified it. Rather than divide, the attack provided a clear point of political and social cohesion, an identifiable enemy and harm perceived as a direct affront. By attacking without an effective prior formal declaration and with a strong element of surprise, Japan made it easier for the conflict to be interpreted as direct aggression, not a war over distant interests. This psychological effect was exactly the opposite of what Tokyo intended. The second fundamental mistake was technical operational in strategic terms. The attack seriously damaged part of the fleet, but did not destroy the elements that would ultimately prove decisive in the Pacific War. In the short term, Japan managed to sink or damage significant ships and destroy aircraft on the ground. But the strike did not permanently eliminate the US's operational capability. Critical supply, repair, and fuel storage infrastructure was not completely destroyed, and the force that would be central in the war, the aircraft carriers, were not in port at the time of the attack. This limited the strategic effect to a delay, not a definitive neutralization. Third, the attack, even if initially successful, did not solve the structural problem. Japan would need to sustain a prolonged naval war to protect the resource routes it sought to capture. Neutralizing the fleet for a few months did not guarantee that Japan could indefinitely transport oil and raw materials against an opponent with massive production capacity and an industry capable of rapidly replacing losses. The attack could open a time window, but that window had to be used to consolidate an irreversibly strong position. This required logistics, fortifications, sea control, and above all, an accurate calculation of the US response. At the level of the decision why it was still attacked, how Japan interpreted its own options also played a role. From Tokyo, the alternative to war was not stable peace, but strategic withdrawal under pressure, with loss of prestige and continued dependence on powers that could again strangle trade in the future. In other words, Japan feared that accepting American conditions would not solve the problem, but postpone it from a weaker position. If that was the interpretation, then the moment to act was before reserves ran out and before the United States completed its preparations. This explains why the final decision was made despite internal doubts. War was seen as a high-risk gamble, but with internal logic: strike first, expand quickly, fortify a perimeter, and then force negotiations. In this logic, Pearl Harbor was the strike that enabled everything else. Without Pearl Harbor, expansion southward seemed too exposed. With Pearl Harbor, it was believed the expansion could proceed with less immediate interference. The immediate consequences demonstrated the partial success of the plan in the short term, but also revealed its limits. Japan was able to launch rapid offensives in the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia, simultaneously attacking multiple targets. Within weeks, it advanced on key strategic positions, exploiting initial confusion and the dispersal of Allied forces in the region. This reinforced the perception in Tokyo that the gamble had worked. The imperial perimeter was expanding and access to resources seemed closer. But that early success hid a reality. The United States was entering a total war economy, and there was the hardest blow to Japanese calculations. In a war where the decisive factors were production and logistics, the US had industrial depth and access to domestic resources on a scale Japan could not match. The attack had turned a strategic dispute into a US national mobilization. This mobilization involved not only ships and aircraft, it involved time, replacements, mass training, and sustained industrial expansion. The longer the war lasted, the more the balance tipped. Furthermore, the attack on Pearl Harbor had an immediate global strategic consequence. It facilitated the convergence of fronts in World War II. Japan was already aligned with revisionist powers, but Pearl Harbor accelerated the coordination of efforts and the clear definition of blocs. Politically, the attack eliminated ambiguities. The United States was no longer in a position of pressure without war. It was at open war. This expanded the scope of the conflict and closed the possibilities for partial agreements. Japanese calculations also underestimated a decisive factor. The geography of the Pacific did not only protect Japan, it also protected the United States. The ocean was vast, yes, but the US had the capacity to conduct and sustain a long-term transoceanic war. Japan, in contrast, needed to maintain a vast perimeter with limited resources, support isolated garrisons, protect long-distance convoys, and maintain local superiority at multiple points simultaneously. Every fortified island was a permanent obligation. Every sea route was a vulnerable artery. In the short term, Japan could expand quickly. In the long term, that expansion became a network difficult to sustain. This mismatch between Japan's temporal goal and the US's temporal capacity was at the core of the future defeat, even when in December 1941 the map seemed to favor Tokyo. On December 8, 1941, the US Congress declared war on Japan.